In this episode, number 3, we are focusing on the beginning era of the massively popular home computer, the Commodore 64. Legendary games, immortal soundtracks, and unforgettable stories. I'm Bob Engstrand.
And I'm Jari Karjalainen, and this is...
Retrogame Talkshow.
We're back on the air. And since the feedback segment worked so well the last time, right at the beginning of the show, I think we're gonna make it a regular segment to have right here. So let's start. So let's start by going through our email and social media feedback. Bob, what do you got?
Well, let's see. In the last episode, we spoke about why so many scrolling games make the player move from left to right.
Yeah.
And moving from right to left felt unusual. You and I, we did mention some exceptions like Jungle Hunt and Kung Fu Master. And we wanted the listeners to let us know if they've played other games where you move from right to left.
Yep.
And Mikael Hylén, a familiar name on the show, wrote on our Facebook page and mentioned Legend of Cage.
Yeah.
And it is correct. That game makes you actually move from right to left. Now, I'm not very familiar with this particular game, Legend of Cage. Are you, Jari?
Oof. Well, not very much, I'm afraid. I do remember having played it on a couple of times on on one of those multi-game pirate cartridges on the NES, on which I think it was listed as Legendary. Or something like that. I remember it having this sort of a spelling mistake. And later I found out about it being Legend of Cage. But I can't really say I enjoyed that one. It has kind of awkward controls and silly sort of awkward jumping and everything. Just wasn't my kind of thing, I guess.
Okay. Yeah. And then one Peter from Sweden wrote to us and gave us 2 interesting theories of why the majority of games go from left to right.
Oh, yeah.
First and most obvious, we do read from left to right. So in that sense, it feels natural with a left to right flow.
Yeah, true.
Secondly, movies are apparently using the same trick as where the hero would enter from the left and the evil character would appear from the right. Because according to some human tests, an object moving from left to right feels good, while an object moving from right to left feels uncomfortable. And these are all very interesting aspects which might have very little to do with retro gaming per se, but interesting nevertheless.
Yeah. You know, I found a couple of other games to fit the description a couple of days ago, just by accident. You know, one of my early platforming favorites, which I played a lot on the C64, it was called Stop the Express. I think it was actually an MSX original, but anyway. And then there was another C64 favorite called Hoppin' Mad, which I grew up to know as Cataball because they released it on both names and they had a little bit of different order in the levels, but anyway, I'm pretty sure there's more of these out there, but some really deep digging is definitely required.
Yeah,
but hey, you know what? I'm gonna take this opportunity to mention that you can find our Retrogame Talkshow social media pages on Facebook and Instagram, to which we post our updates and other occasional retro gaming related randomness. And also, if you feel like we're doing a great job at making you guys feel nostalgic, you can support us by donating us a little something on either Patreon or Ko-fi. And there are links down in the description.
Yeah, speaking about donations, we would like to send a big special thanks to Sean in Idaho, United States, for the first ever donation we have received here on Retrogame Talkshow. Thank you, Sean. It means a lot.
Yes. That's really awesome. Thanks, man. And you know what? I do believe this very same Sean has also done a guest post on our Facebook page just lately, telling us this little funny, sort of sad tale of breaking his hand during a fit of rage at losing to Mike Tyson in the NES version of Punch-Out. I think we've all been there, at least to some degree. I remember having tried to punch the old CRT-type TV screen back in the 80s when raging at some annoyingly difficult game.
Ouch.
I can't remember what it was, though. But I do remember it almost broke my hand, too.
Oh, yeah. I remember in the early 90s while playing Kick-Off 2 and Player Manager on my Atari ST, I probably smashed something like 50 light bulbs, so I know everything about game raging. It's very humoristic now when I think about it.
Yeah, 50 light bulbs. That's a bit harsh. At least light bulbs aren't quite as expensive as joysticks or, TVs for that matter.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, can't imagine that having been all that funny to our parents on the long run, though.
Must have been brutal to have a kid obsessed with gaming and randomly breaking stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Sick.
Yeah. Anyhow, more feedback. Another American called Matt, living in Italy, contacted us and shared some of his childhood arcade memories.
Oh, cool.
Matt brought up a certain arcade controller called trackball.
Oh, yeah.
Which is a hard plastic ball which is halfway sunken into the cabinet, which the player can roll in any direction and at any speed for a sense of complete control.
Yeah.
One game Matt mentioned using this trackball controller is Marble Madness from 1984, which also happened to be the very first arcade game to feature stereo sound. Which is pretty cool.
Hey, that's really some great arcade history facts right there.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks for that information. I think I've only played Marble Madness on the Amiga, actually, which I think used the mouse as a controller, which in the context makes very much sense.
Yeah, Matt also mentioned playing Sierra adventure games on his PC.
Yeah.
We mentioned in the very first episode how many games taught us English, and apparently Matt, an English native speaker, also remember learning how to spell certain words, such as throw, through, and walking through something.
Yeah.
Matt also recalled learning what a dagger is at very young age.
Yeah, I have to say, when Matt said something about learning English, when English was his native language, that I really hadn't given it much thought, that playing text-based adventures could be just as useful as a learning tool, even to people who are born into the language. Yeah. But hey, great stuff. Thanks for all your comments and keep them coming.
Retrogame Talkshow.
So Jari, since you have become our professional researcher, can you give us a little background story of the Commodore company?
Yeah, I did a little research, and I found out that the company, Commodore Business Machines Incorporated, was founded in 1954 by this Polish immigrant and Auschwitz survivor called Idak Tragel. And we all know him better as Jack Tramiel. And, this whole business with Auschwitz, this suddenly makes even the whole birth of the company a lot more improbable and interesting. Apparently, Tramiel had wanted to call the company General something, but because there were so many General named companies in North America already, like General Motors and all that, he eventually went for Commodore. I mean, can you imagine we'd be playing on a General 64 instead of Commodore 64?
No, that sounds horrible. I can't imagine that it would turn my whole childhood upside down.
Yeah, exactly. Well, up until the late 1970s, Commodore's business was to make calculators and other smaller scale computers. And in 1977, they became a computer company when they released their first computer, which was called PET 2001. PET had an integrated monitor with monochrome graphics, black and green, I think it was. Most of them didn't apparently have any sounds. Some models did have a beeper, but yeah. And then it had 4 variations with different amounts of RAM, ranging from 4K to 32K, if I remember correctly.
Okay.
And the original PET also had an inbuilt cassette drive, which the later models would lose, and they would have an external drive instead.
So this PET 2001 computer, I guess it's a pretty rare piece of technology. Have you ever played on one or even seen one?
I have never played one or even seen one in real life. I did try it out on an emulator, but somehow to me it felt too far away, if you know what I mean. Well, anyway, variations of the PET computers were continued to be made until 1983. And from what I've read, they were made more specifically for programmers. But to us gamers, things got more interesting when in 1980, Commodore started working on their more family-friendly version of PET, which was back then called MicroPET. The machine would eventually become known as VIC-20 in most countries, while the Japanese had their own language modification released as VIC-1001. Actually, the Japanese version was released before the VIC-20 itself. Then, due to this funny coincidence in the German language, the machine needed to be renamed VC-20 instead for the German market.
Yeah, because VIC can be confused with a German word, which is not a very official way to say making love.
Yeah, you could say that.
Yeah.
The VIC-20 was a tremendously successful machine for its time, and no big wonder, since it had better sound capabilities, more colorful graphics. You could connect it to a TV, so you didn't have to haul a huge machine around in case hauling was needed. Yeah. And then, of course, the VIC-20's library of games got relatively large for a machine of that age. And, people are still making great new games for the VIC-20.
Yeah, I never had a VIC-20 back in the day, and neither did any of my friends. Can you mention some of the most famous VIC-20 games that people might have heard of?
Well, yeah, most of the famous VIC-20 games are actually well-known C64 games as well. And, naturally, there are some arcade ports as well, such as Omega Race and Lode Runner, Frogger, all that kind of stuff. But I guess the few VIC-20 originals that I could mention are Jeff Minter's Grid Runner, then an old favorite of mine, River Rescue, which I actually played a lot more on the ZX Spectrum, but that's a VIC-20 original. And then a couple of exclusives, which definitely worth mentioning, are this Manic Miner sequel called The Perils of Willy, which was only released on the VIC-20. And then this really strange happening of an Ultima game, only released on the VIC-20. It's called Escape from Mount Drash. So it's a very low-key sort of a RPG. Definitely worth checking out if you haven't VIC-20, but I have to warn you, it can become a bit expensive if you want to track it as an original. It's a collector's item, that one.
Cool.
And so we get to 1982, which brings us to the main course, so to speak.
You are referring to the arrival of the Commodore 64, sir.
Indeed I am, sir. The arrival of the C64 itself wasn't anything unexpected, because by the time the C64 was released, every other company had their hand in the 8-bit market already. I mean, Atari had their 8-bit computers around for a few years already. I think they were released in 1977 or 78. And Sinclair had their ZX Spectrum models out, I think it was 5 or 6 months prior to the C64. And in America, the Texas Instruments had their flagship out, the TI-99/4A, out in June 1981. And in Britain, Acorn Computers had also their BBC Micro out the same year. I mean, later in 1981. And with the VIC-20 being as popular as it was, everyone was waiting for Trammell to make his move. And when the C64 came out, the hardware setup was not particularly top-notch for its time, because the processor was not as fast as the Z80 in the ZX Spectrum, for example. But the VIC-2 graphics chip was diverse. There was enough memory to do all kinds of things with it. You got all kinds of ports to attach joysticks and other peripherals to. And the sound chip, that was something that would make all the other computer manufacturers green with envy.
Yeah, you're referring to the legendary Commodore 64 sound chip, the SID chip. Me and my father actually built a Commodore 64 stereo synthesizer from scratch.
Oh, yeah.
Containing 2 SID chips for a true stereo sound. Actually, I made the music that we can hear in the background at the moment using exclusively sounds from that synthesizer that we built.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. Cool stuff.
Yeah, we can and probably will spend a whole episode talking about and listening to exactly what can be done with this really cool sound chip.
That we do.
But yeah, Jari, I'm guessing the reason for Commodore's success wasn't only because of the SID chip.
Well, I think I'd like to think it helped, but the cold truth about it is Jack Tramiel did as he promised and brought computers to the masses, not classes, much like Clive Sinclair did with his ZX computers, but on a much larger scale. While Sinclair got hugely popular only in the UK and Russia and some other European countries on a lesser scale, Commodore took over quite a bit of the American market in 1983-84 when the video game crash happened. And then most of Europe happened in a heartbeat when the C64 came along, because the idea was to start selling C64s in bookshops, convenience stores, whatnot, gas stations or whatever. And this brought the C64 to a much wider customer base than any other computer models had.
Retrogame Talkshow.
So, let's get to the main subject. Bob, what sort of memories do you have of your first encounter with a C64? When and where did this happen? Or did you get to play with it right away?
Let me do some time traveling here. Well, if you recall from our previous episode, I was telling you about our family spending many summer holidays in Italy during the 80s together with another family.
Yeah.
This family had a Commodore 64, the Commodore 64 version that is also known as the bread box or bread bin.
The original.
The original brown, dark brown color. Looks really cool, really vintage look on it. We visited this family a few times a year, and I have a very vague memory of seeing this computer. I had no idea what this computer was. This was probably around 84 or 85. I can't recall if I played any games while visiting them, but I do remember the tape cassette deck and the joystick.
Yeah.
The joystick had a gray base, a black stick, and a white square form button on top of the stick. I would later find out that this joystick is called the Boss and was made by Wico.
Wico, yes. Great company. Lots of great joysticks.
Yeah, they made a lot of joysticks. My parents must have noticed my unusual excitement over this computer, because a few weeks later they told me that their friends would lend me the Commodore 64 for 2 weeks to try it out.
That's great. Cool.
And I remember that I was so excited for that day to arrive that when the day came, I told my parents, quote, "Today, happiness is knocking on the door." I remember my parents giggling about their son's deep emotions towards a, piece of electronic hardware. Still to this day, 30 years later, we are still joking about this phrase.
Yeah, it's very poetic. And I have to say, what a gift for foresight. I mean, happiness is knocking on the door. How much more happy can you get than playing on a C64 for 2 weeks?
Yeah, pretty accurate,
Yeah.
So there it was, the breadbox Commodore 64 in my room. The tape cassette deck and the joystick, the Boss. And of course, very important ingredients, one cassette filled with cracked turbo games.
Ooh.
When I now recall back, my parents' friends must have written down on a piece of paper how to actually load these games, because, Google wasn't really around in 1985.
Yeah, true. I mean, it's not quite as easy as we now think it is. You know, I've seen grown men, nerds even, still struggling to load a game on a C64 and run it.
Ah, losers. But that's true. I mean, it actually requires some minor engineering skills to load a game on tape, especially when the tape won't load. You know, does load arrow seem familiar?
Yeah.
Anyhow, before this episode, I was trying to remember the games on that cassette, and I do remember some of them.
Okay.
One particular helicopter game called Fort Apocalypse stole a lot of time from me during those 2 weeks. I got really hooked on that one. Avoiding laser beams, rescuing allies, and shooting down enemy tanks and helicopters.
Yeah, it's a great game, early classic, and kind of unique also. Not many chopper games that take you underground.
Yeah, that's true. I never really thought about it to be underground. I always felt it like different layers of sorts, but whatever.
Oh, yeah.
Then there was a game called Forbidden Forest.
Ooh.
A game that scared the living daylights out of me, where you ran around with a bow and arrow, shooting giant spiders and other horrific creatures.
Yeah, Forbidden Forest was way ahead of its time, sort of pseudo 3D, and I think it was designed as an interactive cinematic experience. I read about it some time ago. Completely haunting soundtrack also. I think that was amazing stuff.
Yeah, it was actually really scary. I remember some mornings I was the only one awake in the house, and I just couldn't play it, because it was so scary. And then there was a few car games on the cassettes, Burning Rubber and Spy Hunter.
Oh, yeah. Spy Hunter is definitely a classic we all know from the arcades. I did a blog post about Burning Rubber once. It's because it's an arcade conversion. I did a comparison of it. But I don't think it's quite as well known as Spy Hunter for whatever reason. So what can you tell our listeners about Burning Rubber that makes it so special to you?
Well, I mean, Burning Rubber is a view from the top, just like Spy Hunter. In Burning Rubber, you were able to jump really high with your car, and by doing that, you could try to land on other cars, smash them, and get points. Something worth mentioning regarding the soundtrack in the game. The music contained a simple composed melody just for the game, composed for the game, and this melody would seamlessly merge into a very famous classical composition by Johann Sebastian Bach called Jesus bleibet meine Freude. You might know it. It's very funny how they merge together like that.
Yeah, sounds kind of random.
Yeah, I really doubt that good old Bach could have expected this sort of usage of his masterpiece. So let's take a listen to the Burning Rubber soundtrack.
Let's do that. That sounds extremely random,
Yeah, it's so simple also, just one tone at a time, no harmonies, no chords, just
funny stuff.
Typical for 83.
Yeah.
Other games on the cassette, the hysterical game called Frantic Freddy.
Oh, yeah.
Which, by the way, was the only Commodore 64 game I saw my mother play.
Huh. Cool. My mother wasn't really into playing on the C64. I think she got her share of 8-bit gaming on the ZX Spectrum we had before. And her favorite was Percy the Potty Pigeon from Gremlin Graphics. But yeah, I like Frantic Freddy too. It has a great rocking soundtrack.
It's a fun game. I actually didn't understand until the 90s that the Frantic Freddy theme song is the Queen 1980 smash hit Crazy Little Thing Called Love.
Yep.
So let's take a listen to Frantic Freddy.
That sounds so great.
By the way, Jari, Frantic Freddy with a Queen song. Do you have any idea if this has a connection to Queen's singer Freddie Mercury?
I actually have no idea, and to be honest, we might never know. But, I admit I tried to find out about it some time ago. Unfortunately, I found no information regarding that. I don't know, I just guess the programmer must have been a Queen fan.
Then there was this pretty trippy game called Neptune's Daughter, where you swam underwater and shoot harpoon on jellyfish to make your way to something, the other side of the screen. By the way, this is another game of the vast majority that goes from left to right. I just can't seem to let go of that subject.
You're obsessed about scrolling left to right.
Yeah, well, more games. The very first sport game that I ever played on the Commodore 64 was Decathlon. Oh, yeah. And not the Daley Thompson's version, but the one called just Decathlon.
The Activision game.
Yeah, we played this game a bit with my whole family, but there was never a doubt that I was the only computer nerd in the family,
Yeah, I think Decathlon had the same sort of power in our family as well. At least my dad and my brother used to join in every now and then. And we used to play a lot of javelin.
Ah, yeah.
Yeah, javelin was our favorite event. I still remember one of the greatest achievements we had of getting 95.54 meters on a Competition Pro joystick.
Oh, can we get some C64 applause? Not bad at all. There was one more sport game on the cassette, a basketball game called One on One. And even though I lack any interest in basketball, I played this very much. As the name suggests, you played it 1 versus 1, either against a friend or against a computer. And the music in the game is Scott Joplin's ragtime composition from 1899 called Maple Leaf Rag. Let's take a listen. Sounds funny.
Sounds very funny.
Yeah.
I think, Joplin's ragtime compositions have been used in many other games as well, but this particular rendition I think is very unique. The sound of it is very sort of personal.
Yeah, I really think it has a positive vibe, and the synth sound in itself, it's so bright, like there would be a very harsh high pass filter on everything, because everything is very bright,
Yeah.
There was a fighter bomber game called Blue Max.
Oh yeah.
A nice game that stood out in its playability, and I spent pretty much time playing that.
Yeah, I agree. It's a very nice game. But I think there's something kind of odd about it, because for some reason, every C64 gamer that I know has played Blue Max at some point, even though I don't think it's as popular or successful commercially as maybe Whizball or even Gianna Sisters. Don't you think that's a bit odd?
Yeah, I have no idea about the commercial success of Blue Max, but it was also a pretty early game. So, comparing it to Whizball and Gianna Sisters is a tiny bit unfair. But yeah, it's kind of interesting that you have met so many players who have played Blue Max. I think that's
instead of Whizball.
Yeah, oh yeah. I've definitely played Whizball and Gianna Sisters pretty much more than Blue Max. But
there was a trick in the game, I remember, that you could actually fly under the bridges. I can't remember if I've ever actually accomplished that trick. Have you?
Yeah. I can't remember if I've flown on the bridges, but it's very possible. Anyway, I would like to mention one more game on this cassette, and I'm gonna hum the melody and see if you know it.
Okay.
Dum 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 dum. Bum, da, da, ba, ba, bum, bum, bum,
yeah, unmistakable. That's Henry's House.
Henry's House! Yeah, you're right. It's a very nice little cute game. The game has a very nice setting, and you need to take Henry through various traps and obstacles in a spooky old house. This game is very symbolic for this special era for me around 1984. These were some of the games I can remember from my very first C64 cassette.
Well, I can't think of any other word to describe that cassette than epic.
I totally agree. Epic cassette.
Retrogame Talkshow.
Okay, Jari, your turn. I'm very curious to hear your first experiences with the Commodore 64. Please go ahead.
Okay, let's see. Well, the first time I ever saw a C64 was probably in 1986 or 87. I'm not sure. But I'm pretty sure I didn't see one in action until late 87 or early 88 because I have this vague recollection of also playing on the C64 around the same time I ever saw one. I remember it was at a friend of my brother's who lived about a kilometer away from us, and I also remember he had an Atari 800 XL with both a disc and a cassette drive. And both machines have firmly remained somehow nostalgic for me, even though I only got to play a handful of games on the Atari back then. And C64 is what I ended up having. So the first games I remember playing on this guy's C64 were, if I remember correctly, one of them was definitely the Great Gianna Sisters. And Buggy Boy was one of them.
Buggy Boy.
Buggy Boy. We're back to Buggy Boy again. Yeah. And one of them was one of those shooter games from Hughes, and I think it must have been Iridium.
I like that.
Yeah, it's a great game.
Gianna Sisters you mentioned, I mean, that might be the most well-known game on the Commodore 64. I don't think there's one listener out there who hasn't heard about this game. And what a great soundtrack.
Yeah.
Let's take a listen to Gianna Sisters.
Let's do that. That's so nostalgic. Even now, even though I play it kind of regularly.
You also mentioned Buggy Boy. We talked about Buggy Boy a bit in the previous episode about arcades.
Yeah.
And we came to the conclusion that you and we do not like the steering wheel on the arcade. We prefer a simple joystick.
Yeah, that we do. Yes. But I think most of these games that I played back then were loaded from a turbo tape cassette, which I really didn't know about at the time. But I guess that would be the most logical conclusion, since I don't know anyone who had an original tape version of Gianna Sisters at the time. And for that matter, I still don't know anyone who owns an original Gianna Sisters. But that reminds me, I realized we haven't really explained what the turbo tape system is. Do you want to tell them?
Deep breath. Yes, sure. Well, regular original games officially released on cassette would load very slow. Might take anything from 3 to maybe 10 minutes. The earliest games released on tape would all use the same basic ROM loader, which means there is no fast loader scheme to get the data into the memory quicker. All original tape games would use a basic ROM loader block, which is the light blue screen section at the very beginning.
Yeah.
But new custom fast loaders would be used since 1984. The fast loader would, of course, make the actual game data load much quicker. Even still, because games were becoming bigger, some of the originals would load slow enough for you to make, coffee and drink it before the loading was finished. The turbo tape system worked so that first you would need to load and run the turbo tape loader itself, which only took about 25 seconds or so, before loading the actual game file, which would be maybe 5 times quicker than the original cassette version of the game, thanks to this turbo tape.
Yeah. And because you loaded these single files instead of these official mastered games, from tape that would auto-run after load, you would need to learn how to load and run separately, and most likely even save program files on tape. But luckily it wasn't rocket science exactly.
Yeah.
So anyway, where was I? I had my first C64 experiences, and not too long after that, I started to notice other kids had a C64 in the village, and I ended up getting quite a lot of C64 gaming experience before owning the machine myself. It was one of my parents' friends' kids who had another C64, who had a small collection of early C64 tape games from companies like Analog and Interceptor. And I have strong memories of playing some games on that particular C64, which was one of those bread boxes too. For some reason, most of the games that I played on the machine were kind of bad, horrible even, like Tom Thumb from Analog.
Okay.
That's a horribly bad sort of maze platformer game. Really not worth anyone's time, but somehow it just haunts me to this day for being so bad. Yeah. And another Analog game called Slapshot, which also got released as International Hockey.
Yeah, I remember playing that game. Hockey game, yeah.
It's a great little ice hockey game for its time. What else? Well, another Analog title called PC Fuzz. It's another one of those stupidly bad games, but I think there's something really oddly charming about it. It gets funnier with time, don't you think?
Now when you mention PC Fuzz, it was that was part of the Epic cassette that I borrowed. Maybe this game will pull down the epicness of that cassette, but yeah, it's kind of funny in a way.
Part of the charm about PC Fuzz is really about being bad, but
Sorry, you mentioned Slapshot. Is that the ice hockey game that has a digital voice sample when you score a goal? That he scores. There's this. I remember.
Yeah, you're right.
Is that Slapshot?
It is.
Okay.
Yes, that's true.
Funny, because I remember playing that, and I remember that I was impressed by a digital sample of a real voice. He scores, like really distorted sample.
Cool.
Yeah,
I didn't even remember that. That's cool.
He scores!
And then there was this maze sort of a shooting game called Zodiac, which I think is something of a clone of a game called Shamus, whatever it's called.
Oh, Shamus. I remember playing Shamus. Yeah.
And, well, Interceptor Software was another company that was well represented in that house. I played a lot of Burger Time there.
Oh,
that was
Burger Time. Great. Getting hungry.
Yeah, I actually am getting a bit hungry. I'll make some burgers. Yeah, Burger Time was it's a classic arcade conversion, I think.
Oh.
Another one I actually got a bit hooked on. I'm still a bit obsessed about this other Interceptor game. It's called Big Top Barney. It's a circus-themed game with 4 very different sort of events in it that you could play in any order. One of them is a tightrope trapeze sort of a thing that you walk on and jump over these monkeys and through fire hoops and all that.
Okay.
Well, that's a regular left to right scroller. Okay. And then there's another scroller, but it scrolls to the other side.
Again.
There's another event in the game that scrolls to the opposite side of the screen. That's a bit cool.
Okay.
Yeah, that's where you ride this unicycle and jump over these trampolines.
Okay.
But hey, I still want to get back to talking about loading games, because I think this might seem a bit weird, but I remember the first times I attempted to load a game from cassette tape on a C64, I remember being kind of baffled, because the light blue screen taking over at first and hearing nothing at all. since I had gotten used to the Spectrum's beeping and screeching and all that from the very beginning of loading on a tape, and seeing these blue and red lines taking over the screen borders on a Spectrum. I remember loading games from cassette on my Sword M5 computer, and that was also an extremely loud and noisy method. Because I was a Spectrum gamer before, it was more reassuring to see and hear the loading happening on the TV screen. But then again, now that I've used the C64 for almost 30 years, I have to admit, hearing the loading noise that the 48K Spectrum makes through its inbuilt beeper can become a bit diabolic after a few minutes, because it's so loud. It's insane, yeah. So hearing some Rob Hubbard or Martin Galway tunes playing while your game loads is definitely preferable.
Yeah, absolutely.
Retrogame Talkshow.
Okay, so we're coming towards the end of our show this time already, and before we wrap up, there's something we forgot to mention in our introduction in the first episode, was how we met, which I think is an important factor on the basic style of this podcast, because the thing is, Bob contacted me kind of randomly on a C64-themed website, which is the Lemon 64 forum, just after he had moved from Malmö to Helsinki in 2004.
Yeah, I really didn't know anything about the Commodore 64 scene in Finland, and I decided to contact some Finnish users on the Lemon 64 forum, and yeah, you were one of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we fast forward a bit, and then we meet for real for the first time in Kuopio, where I used to live at the time.
Yeah, I think that was back in 2005. I was playing a show there with some band, and you came and checked it out, and we had some time to hang out and talk some random Commodore 64 stuff,
I think we even played some Gauntlet and whatever.
Possible.
But yeah. Fun times. Funny how quick you develop nostalgia these days.
Yeah.
But yeah, things were kind of special back in those days for both of us, I think. Because lots of unexpected happenings, meeting new people, getting to know the, let's say, sort of the light and the dark of Finnish music scene, I guess. Developing our particular sort of weird random humor in our mutual conversations through these 13 years or so.
Yeah.
Most of which has been based on C64 related stuff.
Buggy Boy.
Buggy Boy. We had a very, very sort of underground project that we had in 2005 and 2006, which is so far actually our only mutual music related thing we've done, and this was called Mölli and Laudis.
That little Mölli and Laudis project we had, some weird music combined with a lot of C64 samples and unexpected musical styles on top of each other.
Exactly.
And,
there's even a super cheap video of our hit single, if you will, Natti Växjö on YouTube.
Yeah, I mean, this is really sick stuff. I mean, if this wasn't a free country, we would end up in a mental hospital or something. But yeah, let's take a listen to En natt I Växjö for a few seconds, just so people can hear how far out it actually is. I can't believe
Yeah, it still sounds so far out.
That's out.
Yeah. But anyway, that was a huge part of what sort of ignited our interest in creating some weird stuff for the internet, and the idea of a podcast came around that time, I think.
I mean, we would probably be able to continue on this subject for a couple of episodes worth, but we need to wrap up this episode now, and thanks everybody for tuning in once again. We hope you have enjoyed our third episode.
Yeah, if you did, please consider supporting us on Patreon or Ko-fi.
Exactly. Comments and suggestions are welcome as ever. Check out our Instagram and Facebook pages and write some comments there. And if you want to be more discreet, throw us a line at our email, which is retrogametalkshow@gmail.com.
So, in the upcoming episode, we will continue our introduction to Commodore 64 story, when tons of new amazing games enters the scene, such as Crackout, The Last Ninja, Defender of the Crown, Maniac Mansion, Paradroid, Whizball, Buggy Boy. No, Buggy Boy is already there. Much more, but yeah.
Yeah, I actually can't wait for that next episode. But until then, I'm Bob.
And I'm Jari, and we thank you for listening to Retro Game Talk Show. Cheers!
Bye-bye.